So to tonight's speaker, Lainie Anderson, speaking on Sir Ross Smith and the epic flight that shrank the world. I think we often marvel at the feats of the early navigators from Europe and the Pacific, and there are many among us who remember the tyranny of distance, the 4 to 7 week ship trips from the Northern Hemisphere to the Southern Hemisphere or vice versa. This talk tonight is about voyagers, navigators, pioneers, aviation pioneers, who I think set a benchmark that has rippled through our nation from the 1920s and ultimately into space. Lainie is a journalist and Sunday Mail columnist with 30 years' experience, including stints at the Herald Sun in Melbourne and the Times in London. Lainie, in 2017, won a Churchill Fellowship to research the 1919 air race from England to Australia, won by the pioneering South Australian aviators Ross and Keith Smith. The Smith brothers made their triumphant return to Adelaide 101 years ago on the 23rd of March 1920. Lainie has since written an historic fiction on the race called The Long Flight Home and has co-produced a documentary presented by NASA astronaut and Society member Andy Thomas. Lainie was South Australia's Epic Flight Centenary 2019 Program Ambassador. Members and visitors, Lainie Anderson.
Thank you, Rod, that's very nice. And thank you everybody for having me here tonight. It's lovely to be here. Who has heard me speak before on this topic? Okay, a few. So I apologise if all the gags are the same. And it is a 45-minute talk and I've given it many times and I can't change it each time, even though I know that some people are going to hear it again. So thank you very much for coming, even though you've heard it before. So as Rod kindly said in his introduction, I'm a Sunday Mail columnist and I started with the Sunday Mail in 2007. And it was only a couple of years later.
You switched it on.
I have. Is it not loud enough? Are you okay? You can hear me in the back? Okay. So, in 2009, sorry, can't you hear me?
I can hear.
You can? Okay. In 2009, I had an email from a Sunday Mail reader saying, Lainie, could you please write a story on the Vickers Vimy at the airport? And I thought, yeah, I sort of remember a plane at the airport. So I went down and thought, yes. And I'm sure many of you remember the plane at the airport as well, right? Oh, thank you. Thank you, that's better. Is that better? Yeah. So, now I can even hear myself. How scary. Anyway, so I went down to the airport. Now we're going to get that. No worries. Went down to the airport. You would all remember when we were growing up, it had pride of place outside the old airport terminal. Originally in its beautiful glass hangar, and then when sort of my era, in the late 70s and 80s, it had that sort of sepia barrier around it that had the beautiful paintings of the Vimy on it. So that's sort of how I remembered it. But when I got up close to the Vimy, I thought, yes, I remember this. Okay, I can write a story on the fact that suddenly it didn't have pride of place out the front of the old terminal. It was in the arse end of the airport, in the long-term car park. And why should that be, and why should anyone care that it hadn't moved with the new terminal? So I went home, and luckily the internet had already been invented, and I got Googling and could not believe. Sorry, I've got to remember my thing. So there you go. That's how it used to look, and today that's what it looks like now in the long-term car park and the staff car park. Seen maybe by maybe 1,000 people, if we're lucky, who manage to notice that it's there and walk through on their way to and from the long-term car park. But so when I went home and started researching Ross Smith, I just could not believe that I hadn't learnt about him in school. And who did learn about him in school? Because I know some eras, if you got the right teacher in the right era, you learnt about him. But the vast majority of South Australians have not learnt the name of Ross Smith. So he was amazing. He was born in the late 1800s in Semaphore, down near Port Adelaide. He grew up on Mootaroo Station, a 3,000 square mile sheep station up near the border with New South Wales, near Broken Hill. His dad worked for Peter Waite and Bar Smith and all those blokes to manage this property, and he was so good at it. He was one of the first in Australia to have these massive pipelines, and he created these huge dams on this property, and he was actually running in the desert. He was running up to 120,000 head of sheep. So Ross and his brother Keith grew up on this property where they learnt amazing bush skills and how to ride horses and how to read landscapes. So when war broke out, he was very well equipped to go away, and he went away with the light horse on the very first, in that huge convoy that went away right at the start of the war. So he fought in Gallipoli at the Battle of Romani, and it wasn't until 1917 that he joined the Australian Flying Corps. Like many of the light horse guys did, because the top brass had this idea that guys in the light horse, because they knew how to ride a horse, they would know how to fly a plane. In fact, when I was doing research for my Churchill Fellowship, there was one general in England who so believed in the likeness of horses and planes that when he landed his little plane, one of the very first planes, he tethered it to a tree. It's true. That's a true story. I'm not making it up. Anyway, so Ross had gone away with the light horse, joined the Australian Flying Corps down in Egypt, and so he only had about 18 months in the Australian Flying Corps. But according to the Australian War Memorial, by war's end, he was Australia's most highly decorated airman. He'd won the Military Cross twice and the Distinguished Flying Cross 3 times. That's for reconnaissance, for bravery in the air, for his observation work and photography. He was an amazing young man who could manage down and manage up, and he rose quickly through the ranks. He was even Lawrence of Arabia's pilot during the war. He flew Lawrence of Arabia out to the Arab tribes. So just an incredible young man, and I thought, wow, I don't know this man, and why don't I? So I wrote this first column in the Sunday Mail, and I was inundated by letters and emails, and the story sort of took on a life of its own. People, unbeknownst to me, because I hadn't got my head around the story, but RSL groups and veterans groups had been campaigning for years, and the Aviation Museum and the Transport Museum that used to be on Marion Road, they were all like really focused on trying to get the airport to do something about this plane and give it some prominence. So, you know, there were committees formed, and one thing led to another, and years went past, and someone said, Lainie, write a book. Lainie, why don't you apply for a Churchill Fellowship? So I always do what I'm told. True. And my husband's not here to argue. And I went away on a Churchill Fellowship, which not only allowed me to go away for 7 weeks without my husband and children and start a thought and finish a thought, which is very difficult for mums, but it also allowed me to build a business case for this flight, on the significance of the flight and the plane. So that's sort of where it took me, and I went away for 7 weeks and visited 9 countries and basically retraced the route. And so before that, I was thinking, yes, I'd write a book, and probably because I'm a journalist, non-fiction or creative non-fiction was the way to go. But as I sort of learnt more and more about the story and the men, I realised, and what had been written before, I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. I thought, yes, I'm going to do it as an historic fiction. But one of the things that made me think this was a story that I wanted to not just talk to aviation enthusiasts about, but to broader audience, and particularly women about, was the whole race and just how amazing it was. I wanted to try and get the story to as wider audience as possible. So I'm going to take you back, tell you about the Great Air Race, which is why the actual flight by the Smith brothers came about. So, in March 1919, Billy Hughes, Australian Prime Minister, was flying from Paris, or between Paris and London, for the peace talks. And it was his first time flying, and he realised that it was really quite a nice way to get from A to B. He had an election coming up. His young country had sacrificed 60,000 young Australians in the war. He was determined that their loss wasn't going to be in vain. He also had a country that was being ravaged by Spanish influenza. And with the election coming up, he wanted to try and inspire his young nation. So he announced a £10,000 prize for the first Australians to make it home from England to Australia in under 30 days. They could take off at any time. They weren't all going to take off on exactly the same day. They just had to make it home in under 30 days. It had to be a British-built plane, and the crew of at least 2 had to all be Australians. So the media around the world had a field day, and his own cabinet went into revolt because despite massive advances in aviation, the planes were still made of wood and wire and fabric. You'll see how crazy some of them are in a minute. Navigation was basically a compass and a speed drift indicator and looking over the side and following a railway line or a river or the coastline. And open cockpits. And after India, there were basically no airfields. So crazy, right? Crazy. So, despite that, 6 Australian crews took up the challenge. And I know that you're going to instantly recognise at least one of these guys. And the more I learned about this story, the more I realised just how much South Australia punched above its weight in early aviation. Because of the 6 Australian crews, 4 were led by South Australians. So we had Roger Matthews, who'd flown with the Royal Flying Corps over the Western Front during the First World War. Cedric Howell, another South Australian, he was flying with the Royal Flying Corps over France and Italy. He was amazing. He was quite highly decorated. On one day, he took on 18 enemy planes and took out 5 of them single-handedly. Hubert Wilkins, he wasn't the pilot, but he went on as navigator, and because of his higher rank, he was considered the captain. He was on this BLACKBURN KANGAROO plane, and look at how crazy this is. It's got 2 cockpits before and 2 after the wings. I mean, how did that fly? Who knows? Anyway, anyone who has studied Hubert Wilkins knows how extraordinary he was as well, and he went on to have an amazing career as an explorer. But during the war, he'd also won 2 military crosses for outstanding bravery. He, was a war artist and correspondent, but he did things like he discovered this group of army lower ranks, American lower ranks, and they'd lost all of their senior ranks, had all been killed. So he just put down whatever he was doing, his either painting or taking photos, and got them behind the lines to safety. He was just such an amazing young guy. Then we had Roger Dodger Douglas, a boxer from Queensland, and Little Ray Parer, a Victorian. They were the other contestants who had all signed up well and truly before Ross Smith came along. So Ross was backed by his brother Keith, who was 2 years older than Keith, but Ross was always the boss. So when war broke out, Ross had said, I'm going off to war, you got to stay home and look after Mum. And Keith said, all right, and he did that for a little while, but then he tried to enlist a couple of times here in Australia. He couldn't get recruited due to, we think it was maybe varicose veins. He had that operated on, and then he caught a ship to England where he joined up with the Royal Flying Corps. So he only was, I say only, he was an instructor with the Royal Flying Corps. He didn't see service over the Western Front. However, instructors had probably the most dangerous job in the First World War, flying instructors. The average young recruit at the start of the First World War had a life expectancy as an airman of 2 weeks. Unbelievable, hey? They were sent over to fill up gaps in the mess halls on the Western Front so that they wouldn't the morale wouldn't be lowered by seeing all these empty chairs at night of the young blokes who died in the air. So they were sent off without adequate training. So Keith was trying to teach them, and other instructors were trying to teach them as quickly as they could to get their skills up. And these young guys, they ruined the undercarriage of 6 planes and totally destroyed 2 planes. And guys like Keith were trying to teach them and were up there with them. So I say only an instructor, but he wasn't only an instructor. And he was also learning how to fly and to navigate in really dodgy winter weather in England, which was going to be crucial, as you'll hear in a minute. So he was Ross's navigator. And the other 2 guys are Wally Shires, who's the narrator in my book, and another South Australian, and Jim Bennett from Victoria. They had joined the Australian Flying Corps down in Egypt, like Ross, and they were his air mechanics. They had gained fantastic skills on flying big machines and particularly Rolls-Royce engines like these 2, 360 horsepower Rolls-Royce Eagle 8 engines, which were on the Handley page that Ross flew down in Palestine, and they were again on this Vickers Vimy plane. So the Vickers Vimy, looking at it now, you probably think, oh, I don't know if I want to get in that. At the time, it was absolutely state-of-the-art. It had only just come off the production line. In fact, it hadn't even seen war service. It was so new. So when Ross convinced the Vickers to give him that Vimy, he was absolutely the man to beat. You'll notice the registration letters there are GEAOU. They thought that probably meant God help all of us. Just want to give you a few, these are other things that I came across when I was researching it and why I just think, wow, truth really is stranger than fiction sometimes. So you would recognise the guy up in the top left-hand corner as Charles Kingsford Smith. He was originally going to be on that Blackburn Kangaroo that Hubert Wilkins was on. He was kicked off by Mr. Blackburn himself, the owner of the company. This is in the autobiography of this guy, who is Dickie Williams, who went on to be Sir Richard Williams, the founder of the RAAF. So in his autobiography, he's another Moonta guy, can you believe it? Another South Australian. So he commanded the Australian Flying Corps No. 1 Squadron down in Palestine and Egypt. And then when Billy Hughes announced the race, he sent Dickie off to England so that he could work with the British Air Ministry to manage the race and get it all going, right? So in his autobiography, he claims that Charles Kingsford Smith was kicked off the Blackburn crew because he was bringing the tiny fledgling British air industry into disrepute by over-insuring planes and deliberately crashing them for the insurance money. Yes, but it gets worse because other biographies that I'm not attributing this to Dickie because I don't think Dickie would say anything like this, but other biographies suggest that Kingsford Smith in that period after the war was also landing planes in unregulated airfields or farmland for trysts with young ladies. He had the nickname of King Dick, apparently. Anyway, up the top here is Bert Hinkler. He was the very first guy to enter the race, but he cracked it when he wasn't allowed to fly solo. He wanted to fly his SOPWITH, his SOPWITH, solo back to Australia. When he was told he had to have a navigator, he pulled out, but he had the last laugh, of course, because he became the first solo airman from England to Australia in the late 20s. And of course, Charles Kingsford Smith had the last laugh by flying across the Pacific and becoming the most famous Australian airman. And also I think he is one of the reasons why the name Smith and Ross and Keith Smith has been lost because the names have been conflated. Like, I can talk to a crowd like you, and at the door you'll say, "Oh, thanks for telling us about Charles Kingsford Smith," and I'll punch you, so don't anyone say it. So the last guy here, who knows who that is? It's a hard one. That is Keith Murdoch. Another South Australian. Oh no, was he South? No, it was a Melburnian, but he started the Advertiser. So he does have a good link. And, you know, if he was alive, he'd be my boss. So we'll be nice to him. Anyway, this is fascinating because Keith Murdoch, at the time, he was the manager of the United Cable Service in London. So a bit like AAP or Reuters today. So all the newspapers around the world had signed up to United Cable Service, or lots of them. So he stitched up one of the very first exclusive deals with Ross Smith before he flew off. So every time Ross Smith landed, he had to send a cable back to Keith Murdoch and say what had happened during the day. So he was providing this first-hand account. We did this, I took off and we flew this and that, all of that. And so the next day's papers across the world had Ross Smith's first-hand accounts. So across the world, people were following this story, and the whole world was just totally like loving it, into it, talking about it, naming their kids Ross and Keith, and it was just crazy. Anyway, the other little cameo role that I want to talk about, because I love this story and it's all true, is Biffy Borton. So Biffy Borton, he was second in command of the Royal Flying Corps down in Palestine and Egypt, and it's a bit of a complex quirk, but really the Australian Flying Corps was part of the Royal Flying Corps, even though we were the only Dominion to have our own separate force. Anyway, Biffy was in command really of the Australian airmen, and apparently he had a monocle, he was very spiffy, and the Australians always said he was the most whattish bloke you've ever met, and he'd walk around like this and say, "I love my Australians, they're mine to a T," and all this sort of stuff. Anyway, they all loved him, and he and Ross became best mates. So when Ross and Wally and Jim were landed back in England, they hadn't yet convinced Vickers to give them a plane. In fact, no one had been able to convince Vickers to give them the Vimy, because John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown, in the June of 1919, had already flown across the Atlantic, and they're probably names that you would recognise because they're famous. So and they'd done that in a Vickers Vimy. So Vickers had all the great marketing they really needed from that flight, and didn't really want to risk it on this crazy flight to Australia. So they'd said no to everybody who'd asked. But guys like Biffy got the likes of Winston Churchill anyway, another really famous guy that I can't think of, to talk to Vickers and get them to give Ross a plane. And in the meantime, Biffy said, "Why don't you blokes come and stay with me?" And so they went and stayed in his 15th century estate down in Maidstone in Kent. That's Chevaney is the name of the house. And look at it, isn't it divine? And I just love, here's Wally and Jim with the Borton family, the Colonel. You know, these blokes were absolute British aristocracy, and I love that our working class lads are there with them living in that house. Just fabulous. They stayed there for 6 weeks until Vickers finally said, "Yes, you can have the plane." And then they moved on site and basically slept under the plane at Vickers for 6 weeks while they got the plane ready. So I told you the planes were made of wooden wire and fabric, and you can see here just how true that is. So you've got the upper wing there is the wood, and you've got these beautiful young ladies here, the Vickers Aviation ladies, whose job was to sew huge bolts of linen fabric together to make sort of like these sleeves that they would fold over the wooden frame of the plane. Then they would pour boiling water over it to shrink down the fabric over the frame, and then they would paint it with a lacquer, or that they called it dope. It was like a lacquer that was so toxic the ladies had to drink lemonade to stop from fainting. So just crazy. So I told you that the plane was too late to see active service, but it was built as a long-range bomber to take out German cities and also U-boats in the English Channel. So originally there was a cockpit at the front, then just behind that there was another cockpit where the pilot and the navigator sat. Then there was a heap of bomb racks, and then a third cockpit for a machine gunner. So they took out the bomb racks and put in extra fuel tanks. And the guys working on the plane said to Ross, don't land anywhere dodgy because she'll just go up. It's basically a fuel tank. So, and it all took place in, any motoring enthusiast would recognise Brooklands, which is the really famous banked motor racing circuit south of London in Weybridge. And that's where the British aviation industry basically had its centre during the First World War. So those two wings opened and the plane came out and the VIMI took off. So the first day so as I said, they didn't all take off at once. They all had to take off, but they had that 30-day time frame to get to Australia, which sounds quite unlikely. Anyway, 12th of November 1919, the VIMI is ready to go and you can see snow on the ground. The official weather report said totally unfit for all flying. And Ross Smith said, no, we're going anyway. And it's because of this man, Etienne Poulet. So Etienne Poulet was a crazy Frenchman who flew this Quadron G4, and he had test flown about 1,000 of these during the war, and he was, as a Frenchman, unable to claim the £10,000 prize money, but he was capable of stealing the glory, and he wanted to do that for Vive la France, and he was thousands of miles ahead because he'd taken off a month earlier. So Ross Smith, and look, it's the Quadron G4 doesn't really even have a proper fuselage. It has just a few bits of steel linking the tail wing to the top, and they basically sat on the top of the plane there. It had it's only little, it's like not half the size of the VIMI, and it had twin 80 horsepower rotary engines that didn't even turn at the same time. And so twin 80 horsepower, and Ross had the Rolls-Royce twin 360 horsepower. So if Ross could catch him, he was going to beat him, but he had to catch him first. So that's why Ross said, we've got to get away because the English winter could set in and we'll never get down there. So on the very first day, so I know I've got 45 minutes, but just tell me just tell me to shut up when you're ready. Okay. So the very first day, right, totally unfit for all flying. There's no visibility in England. Over the English Channel, they get a little bit of visibility. The dear guys at Chevaney, Biffy, Borton and the gang, had painted Godspeed on the lawn and they didn't even see that. Anyway, they get out on the English Channel and they see this massive storm cloud over France. And Ross Smith wants to fly at 3,000 feet, but he's forced to go in and out of the storm clouds, and he's forced to fly at 9,000 feet for 6 hours with zero visibility. They're flying in and out of these huge snow clouds, these icy clouds, and the wings of the VIMI had ice on them. Their goggles froze. They had to take those eyes out and fly without them. Their sandwiches froze. Everything froze. And poor Wally and Jim, they're in the back cockpit, right? So it's probably about that wide. They're facing one, so the open cockpits here, they had two little seats on either side of the cockpit where they faced one another. Wally was only tiny, like 5'4", but Jim was a big lanky bloke. So you can imagine, and all they weren't allowed any weight. So they could only take a toothbrush and a shaver and the clothes on their backs. But the guys in the back, they had all of their spare parts and all of their tools. So they're in the back of this plane at 9,000 feet, rocking all over the place. It just would have been, and freezing cold. So Keith, as navigator, all he can do for 6 hours is sit with a map and a compass and a speed drift indicator, and at 15-minute intervals, he marked where he thought they might be on the map. And after 6 hours, they spot a hole in the cloud, they fly down, and they're only 40 miles from where Keith thought they might be, from Lyon. And they fly in and spend the night in Lyon. So amazing. So Keith's experience during the war was proved absolutely pivotal on day one. So the second day, they fly from Lyon to Pisa, and it rains solidly for 2 days. And after 2 days, so they wake up the next morning thinking they're going to fly off, raining, no go. The following day, it's still raining, but Ross is like, we've just got to take off. So they're stomping around the plane in view of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The plane is in this lake of water in this farmland, or sort of the Royal Flying Corps, but basically farmland. They're stomping around trying to find a spot that isn't too deep for them to make a bit of a runway. And they've got 30 Italian mechanics with this big planks of wood, and they're trying to prise the Vimy out of this bog. But every time they start to taxi, because the engines are so heavy, top heavy at the front, the nose dives. So Ross comes up with this idea. And because Jim is the taller of the two mechanics, he says, Jim, what I want you to do is run along, holding down the fuselage near the tail wing, and just run along with the plane to stop the nose from dipping. And when you feel the wheels start to take off, just run and jump in the back cockpit and Wally will catch you. Plan B, if you don't make it into the cockpit, catch a train to Rome and we'll meet you there. True story. It's in Ross's memoir after the race. And that picture there, up the top there, is it's a drawing, but it shows Wally catching Jim. Just hilarious. So everywhere they went, it was just ingenuity. Every challenge was treated as an opportunity to think of some crazy new scheme to get them back in the air. It was really amazing. Kodak sponsored the race. Every airman on every plane was given a little Kodak camera and some film, and some of the first aviation shots of the world were taken during the race. Wrigley's also sponsored the race. Mr. Wrigley had made a fortune during the First World War selling gum to the Allies, and he gave every plane a box of gum. So they get down to Cairo, and they'd flown from Crete that day. So they'd flown over the Mediterranean and down along the north coast of Africa, and Wally's starboard engine was running hot, so hot that Ross had actually had to turn it off for a time. So they land, and Wally discovers that he's got a cracked aluminium induction pipe. So they think, I think this is bad. They cable back to Rolls-Royce and they say, yes, it's a do-over. You need a new engine. It's going to take 4 weeks, race over. Wally remembers, we've got some gum on the plane. How about we all chew it and we make a big lump of gum, and I'll rip it out, and it's probably not likely to burn like some other things will burn on an aluminium. It's going to get really hot. So he wrapped this gum around the aluminium where the crack was on the induction pipe. Then he wrapped induction tape around that, bit of shellac, off they went again, bang. The other thing that's really amazing, a story from the flight, was down in Ramadi near modern-day Baghdad. They were finishing dinner and came out and noticed this really fierce sandstorm whipping up. So with 50 Indian cavalrymen, the 4 blokes, they all stood around the plane and held the plane down with the wings and the fuselage all night, and woke up the next morning with sand up to their knees, but the plane hadn't tipped. So they dug her out and off they went. So just amazing. While the Smith boys and the Vimy were making their way down, the other contestants obviously were taking off at different intervals as well. And sadly, those who feared the race would end in death were right. So of the 6 Australian crews, 4 crashed and 2 crews died. The Alliance Endeavour, this is Roger Dodger Douglas, the Queensland boxer. He and his mechanic took off the day after the Smith boys, and perished within 10 minutes. They crashed and spiralled out of control into an apple orchard. An inquest found that their plane was most likely damaged a couple of weeks earlier in another accident and hadn't been fixed properly in the company's haste to get them away. Cedric Howell, the very brave young South Australian man, and his mechanic crashed and died off the off the island of Corfu in very stormy seas. The locals could hear their cries for help but couldn't go out and save them, sadly. And his dad was so grief-stricken that he made allegations that the race had been fixed in Ross's favour, and other airmen from the race came out to defend Ross. And so that's not a very sad chapter in the race. So Hubert Wilkins' Blackburn Kangaroo crashed into a ditch on a lunatic asylum, next to a lunatic asylum on the island of Crete, and their race was over. But of course, he went on to do amazing things after the race. And the SOPWITH Wallaby, these were really unfortunate, unlucky guys. So they had taken off a couple of weeks before Ross, but they made this crazy decision to go to Germany to pick up some maps from a mate, and then they got snowbound in Germany, and then they finally got out of there after weeks and weeks, and they went down to Yugoslavia and got arrested as suspected Bolshevik spies and locked in a pig farm, and only got away when their captors were drunk and sleeping off bad hangovers. So they ran and got the keys and took off in a hail of bullets, if there was a key, there were keys in those days. Anyway, they crashed and got malaria and crashed again and fixed the plane and made it all the way to Bali, one day away from Australia, and crashed out and couldn't go any further. So poor guys. And here we have little Ray Pera, and you can see those wheels, that's not where they're supposed to be on the plane. So basically, every time Ray Pera landed, he crashed. It got so bad that instead of being called Ray Pera, he got called the Repairer, because he was forever fixing his plane, or Battling Ray Pera, you might have heard of as well. But they did make it home to Darwin in about 7 months, and the plane became the first single-engine plane to make it to Australia, and you can see it today in the Australian War Memorial. It's actually really beautiful in the Anzac Hall, the aviation area. So, while all that was going on, it basically became, for Ross Smith, a battle against Etienne Poulet. So when I was on my Churchill Fellowship, I was lucky enough to be able to retrace the route. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that was to go to the national libraries in all of these places and go and get the newspapers of the day, so I could get the like a original source or primary source materials of all the interviews with the pilots. And one thing that I really laughed at was the fact that everybody loved Poulet. Like, women were swooning and men were handing over their checkbooks, and it was just Poulet this and Poulet that. And I just think Ross Smith would have hated him, because it was in Ramadi. Poulet flew over, he's the dotted line over the Mediterranean, and Ross Smith ducked down. So in Ramadi, he would have hearing when Poulet landed and when he took off and all of that. And so as he follows him down to Delhi, he gets closer and closer, and it's down in Akyab there. See, Rangoon is Yangon today, it was Burma, now Myanmar. And in Akyab, they finally fly, they finally land, and there's Poulet. And he comes over, and by all accounts, he was, is my thing gone off? I've probably exhausted it. Hello, here I am, okay. So by all accounts, he was just as adorable as everyone said he was, because the wheels of the plane had barely finished rolling, and he was out shaking Ross Smith's hand in a sporting-like gesture. Anyway, you can see the Caudron G4 down on the side there, and there's the Vimy. So you can see how the Vimy dwarfed this little plane. Ross and Poulet, as you would expect, got on like a house on fire once they actually met, because they were probably really similar. So they agreed to fly the next day together to Burma, to Rangoon or Yangon, and this is actually in Yangon. And if anyone's actually been there, if you think of the Golden Shwedagon Pagoda, it's just up to the top, where the top of the U basically is. So they flew together, and down in Rangoon, they had never seen a plane before. So can you imagine out from the air, in the space of an hour, 2 planes land from the other side of the world? Like, how amazing would that have been? So anyway, the next day they agree to fly on to Bangkok because they're going over a huge mountain range that hadn't even been mapped or anything. So, but it was so cloudy that Ross was forced to fly for a time at 11,000 feet, which must have been right at the very edge of just being able to survive in that kind of altitude with an open cockpit. So it was so cloudy that Poulet turned back, and after that his engine, and he had major propeller issues, and his race was over. So it became a race with Smith versus the elements and the 30-day timeline. This is my favourite photograph. So they get down to the Dutch East Indies in Surabaya in Indonesia, and they think from the air that the airfield is perfect, but it's actually reclaimed rice paddies. So the top crust is perfect, but then it's just sludge underneath. So as soon as the Vimy stops, it just drops to the axles, and they think, oh my God, our race is over. But Keith Smith has this idea, let's borrow the bamboo matting walls of the villagers' homes. So they put a call out, please donate your bamboo matting walls of your homes, or basically your homes, and all these villagers turn up with the matting of their homes on their heads, and they stitch them all together, and that's the bamboo matting runway that stopped the wheels from going down in the sludge. Isn't that incredible? And they took off. So on the 10th of December 1919, they land in Australia. The whole of Darwin, there's probably about 2,500 people, were there to greet them, and the world went crazy, because don't forget, they're all reading these first-hand accounts from Ross Smith. So the whole world was just absolutely awestruck. People or curators and aviation historians I spoke to around the world said in its day it was as awe-inspiring as man landing on the moon. People just thought it was absolutely impossible that a plane could take off in England and land in Australia. And for what was I going to say? They landed, just in case you're wondering, 27 days and 20 hours is what it took them. So they were just inside that 30-day deadline. Just amazing. So the whole world went crazy. For Ross Smith in particular, he was absolutely feted everywhere he went. In fact, all of the men. They were showered with marriage proposals, their clothes were ripped off, everywhere the Vimy landed, bits of the Vimy were ripped apart. Ross Smith spoke to something like 200,000 people on a speaking tour around Australia, New Zealand and England. All of the guys actually went and spoke. The Vimy was used for fundraising. The Vimy didn't actually... So they landed in the Darwin on the 10th of December, and then, as Rod said, they made their way around to Adelaide, because Ross wanted to see his mum and dad in Adelaide, and said the race wouldn't be over until we land in Adelaide. And it took 3 months, even though it was only 28 days to Darwin, 3 months to get to Adelaide, because the Vimy basically said, no more, and its engines just kept failing. So, in fact, it got so bad that Vickers absolutely forbade Ross to fly from Melbourne, where they met with Billy Hughes and got their £10,000 prize. He said, you are not flying to Adelaide. So what Ross Smith did was give the keys to Billy Hughes, and then Billy Hughes gave the keys back and said, go to Adelaide, and turned off his hearing aid so he couldn't hear everyone saying, you can't do that. Anyway, so interestingly, Ross and Keith were given knighthoods a couple of weeks after the race. And there was lots of anger about that in Australia, but the officers were given knighthoods in those days, and the other ranks not so much. They were given raises in their rank. But when they were given the £10,000 prize money, Ross immediately separated into four, divided it into four, so all the men had equal prize money, as his way of saying we would not have got home without those mechanics. So Ross became an absolute hero, was asked to speak everywhere he went. This is a fantastic photo. This is taken from above obviously, that's Ross flying, and that's North Terrace. There's Lake Torrens, and that's King William Street. Isn't that beautiful? And that's them landing in Adelaide, out at Northfield, which was Harry Butler's airfield, in 1920. And that's Ross speaking on the steps of Parliament House. Oh, and Adelaide, Ross was a member of the Adelaide Running Club when he went away, and you might still notice that there are wings on the A for Adelaide, for the Adelaide Harriers, and those wings were put on there in Ross's memory. So very sadly, all of the fame was very short-lived, because in 1922, Ross and one of his mechanics, Jim Bennett, died in a plane crash in England, in Weybridge. They were planning to circumnavigate the globe. They were trying out a new plane, a Vickers Viking, which was amphibious, and Ross hadn't done much flying, took the controls, and they fell out of the air, basically, and both died. And the whole world went into mourning. Ross had been named the world's foremost living aviator by the New York Times, and the whole world felt the loss. And nowhere more so than in Adelaide, where it's estimated that 100,000 people turned out to witness his funeral cortege make its way from St Peter's Cathedral to the North Road Cemetery. And Tom, you can see that that's the statue. It looks quite like your little man, your statuette. A shilling fund was set up to create a statue, or to raise money for a statue in Ross's honour, and that's just outside Adelaide Oval on the corner of War Memorial Drive and King William Road. And so whenever you go to Adelaide Oval, you probably walk past it many times, and it's really beautiful, so take note. You can see as well that Ross, that painting is in the Australian War Memorial, and that photograph was taken probably only about 3 years earlier, and look how much he's aged. It's like the whole weight of the world was on his shoulders, wasn't it? I don't actually think fame sat very well on his shoulders, but so sad that he didn't live to see out his, to see what was next. Amazing legacies. The RAAF was created in part because these airmen had landed from overseas, so enemy combatants could as well. That's the first stamp that was given to any male that was carried aboard the Vickers Vimy. It's about that big and today worth about $15,000. Queensland was created as a direct result of the race because Hudson Fysh and Paul McGuinness, the Qantas founders, they had been given the job of carving out airfields between Darwin and Brisbane for anyone who made it back to Australia. And that was when they realised just how isolated those outback areas were, and that's why they created Qantas. The Sir Ross and Sir Keith, so Keith Smith married Lady Anita Smith, and when she died in 1986, she bequeathed their entire estate to the Sir Ross and Sir Keith Smith Fund, and still in that time has given out millions and millions, and still does, to the advancement of aeronautics and aerospace education in South Australia. There's Amy Johnson is there to symbolise the era, the sort of golden era of pioneering aviation feats that took place after this flight. And that is, I'm sure cricket fans recognise that guy, Keith Miller. His middle name was Ross Miller, so Keith Ross Miller. He was born in November 1919, and there were so many men, or young boys, or babies, named Ross and Keith. I found one poor kid in country New South Wales who was called Keith Ross Smith Vickers Vimy Orange Bennett for the name, an orange. Anyway, Wally Shires wasn't in there, and I'm a bit unhappy about that. But poor kid. Anyway, just very quickly to finish, that is Alcock and Brown's Vickers Vimy, and that has been in the Science. No, it's not the Science Museum. What's in South Kensington in London? Is it the Science Museum? Yeah, the Science Museum. Yeah, it's been in the Science Museum since 1919, and it's seen by about 3 million people every year. So obviously we want our VIMI to have, that be up in lights like that. The curator, one of the curators at the Smithsonian in Washington, said if our VIMI was in America, it would be gold-plated in the middle of the Smithsonian. So it was fantastic to come back from my Churchill Fellowship and be able to join with so many like-minded people and create the Epic Flight Centenary here in South Australia in 1919. And we had Andy Thomas and Sir Angus Houston as our patrons, and it was just absolutely fantastic. It looks like me and a bunch of blokes, but there was another lady, so and they were all adorable. Love them. Anyway, nationwide in 2019, there was so much going on. The Royal Australian Mint created coins, and these Australia Post created stamp collections, books, and even gin was created to mark the occasion. Without doubt, the best thing that happened though was just before the federal election in 2019, both the Coalition and Labor announced that they would fund relocating the VIMI to the tune of $2 million. That was matched by the state government and also Adelaide Airport Limited. So that's $6 million to relocate the plane, and that will happen by the end of this year into a new purpose-built facility inside the new airport terminal. That will be seen by... Yay! So that will be seen outside, mainly at night because the glass is so thick, but you'll actually be able to walk inside. It'll be temperature controlled, but there'll be like vacuum sealed doors, so you'll be able to walk around inside with the actual plane, and you'll be able to see it from above from the Virgin Gates area. So really excited. I haven't been down to sort of see where it's going to go yet, but can't wait for that. That's really fantastic. I decided to write Long Flight Home as a fiction because 2 non-fiction books had been written in 1969, and they're outstanding books, and I didn't want to recreate them. I also wanted to write basically an adventure story for girls and a romance for men. So I have Wally telling the story. As he did, he used to sit in the Hilton pub on South Road here in Adelaide and tell his story of his loves, Helena Alford, who he was engaged to in Narrandera before the war, and this amazing race that he went on with Ross Smith, his hero. So Wally was just an ordinary guy, and I wanted to introduce the world to the hero who is Ross Smith through the eyes of an ordinary man like Wally. And my final slide shows Andy Thomas, who we asked to be the presenter and narrator of our documentary, which aired on SBS, which was fantastic. We asked Andy because he's intrinsically linked to this story. So he actually was inspired to study science and then do engineering at Adelaide Airport after a trip to the Adelaide University, after a trip to the airport to see the VIMI with his dad when he was a little tacker. And when he travelled into space aboard the spaceship Endeavour in '96, he carried Ross and Smith's fabric wings from the First World War. So he was an absolute gem to work with, and you can see from his face that he actually looks quite like Robert Redford, so he was perfect on the screen. And just absolute gentleman, a really, really lovely man. And that's it. So thank you so much, and I'm probably over time, but